wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. We shall overcome.
The scruffy hill country outside Austin, Texas was a dirt-poor region so isolated it had no electricity or running water. It was home to Lyndon B. Johnson, a young Texan who wanted to do big things with his life. And from early on, he had a deep and genuine compassion for the poor and the oppressed.
When I was a young man, I taught in a Mexican-American school. And there I got my real deep first impressions of the prejudices that existed and the inequity of our school system between whites and brown.
Lyndon Johnson was born to be a politician. He was 29 when he was first elected to Congress. During the next 10 years, he got the government to help finance slum clearance projects and low-cost housing. Money he got for the region helped farmers go from horse and plow farming to 20th century machinery. And he brought electricity to the hill country.
Write your uncles and your cousins and your aunts and ask them to join you in electing Lyndon Johnson to the Senate.
After 12 years in the U.S. Senate, in 1961, Johnson became John F. Kennedy's vice president. And in 1963, following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson became the nation's 36th president.
My fellow Americans, all I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today.
Johnson was grief-stricken by Kennedy's death, but he now had the opportunity all his life had prepared him for. Determined to address poverty as no president ever had before, he launched a visionary program he called the Great Society.
I want to be the president who helped the poor to find their own way, who helped to feed the hungry, and who protected the right of every citizen to vote in every election.
President Johnson believed that the government had an obligation to uplift ordinary citizens. He himself had grown up quite poor in Texas, and he really felt that poverty itself was a limitation on people's freedoms. And he said very explicitly that there are many freedoms out there which the government really needs to encourage: freedom of education, freedom of employment, freedom of opportunity in all sorts of ways. If you are desperately poor, you simply lack the ability to make choices, to pursue opportunities, and that is in itself a violation of your freedom.
Democratic processes was demonstrated in the United States as the Republicans and the Democrats.
Johnson was elected president in his own right in 1964, receiving the highest ever percentage of the popular vote.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Working closely with the Democratic Congress, he was able to get an extraordinary array of legislation passed. His Great Society programs benefited poor children, the jobless, and the elderly. But fighting poverty was expensive. And during the 60s, something else began competing for federal funds. It was a war in Southeast Asia, the war in Vietnam.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Darling, hear my heart.
We got into the war in Vietnam one step at a time. The issue of communism pulled us in. It was believed communism was the free world's enemy, and it was spreading fast in many parts of the world. Most of the advisors to Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson believed we should fight on the side of what became known as South Vietnam against the communist-supported rebels in the northern part of the country. Then, in August 1964, an American destroyer was attacked by the North Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin. Though it wasn't exactly clear what had caused the incident, President Johnson got Congress to pass a resolution that let him go to war. In 1965, we began bombing North Vietnam. Before we finished, we would drop more bombs on that small country than we had on both Germany and Japan during all of World War II. And we sent soldiers, lots of them.
I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle. And this is the most agonizing and the most painful duty of your president.
Most of our soldiers were decent and honorable. Many were heroic in their effort to help the people of Vietnam. But U.S. policy also allowed for abuses. Large areas of South Vietnam were designated free fire zones, which meant all persons encountered in them were considered enemies. Our soldiers found themselves killing not just other soldiers, but innocent villagers too. The war became a national nightmare. It went on and on and on, becoming the longest war in U.S. history. We killed and were killed, and Johnson began finding his supporters dropping away.
Johnson kept saying, we are fighting in the name of freedom, but it became more and more implausible as we rained bombs down on Vietnam, as it became very clear that our allies, the South Vietnam government, were corrupt and lacked popular support. It seemed like the idea of freedom was being violated in very powerful ways by the war in Vietnam, rather than being fulfilled.
We thought we were doing the right thing when we began. We thought we were fighting for freedom. But in the Vietnam War, we lost our way. At home, along the banks of the Mississippi River and all throughout the South, another battle was going on. The battle for civil rights. President Johnson's Civil Rights Act hadn't solved the voting problem. It did allow black people to check into any hotel they desired, sit on buses wherever they wished, and eat in any restaurant. But in much of the rural South, blacks still couldn't vote.
Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult. But about this, there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote.
But in Alabama, Governor George Wallace had a very different outlook. He not only opposed black voting rights, he was strongly in favor of segregation.
In
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In Selma, Alabama in the 1960s, more than half of the city was African American. Yet only about 1 of every 50 eligible black voters was registered. Black people who tried to register to vote were often given impossible questions to answer, or asked to pay a poll tax they couldn't afford, or they were simply pushed away.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed beforehand. You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse, and we're not going to have it.
On March 7, 1965, 600 people, men, women, and children, set out from Selma on a 54-mile march to Alabama's capital, Montgomery. There, they intended to face Governor George Wallace and demand their right to vote. They marched the first 6 blocks, singing as they went. But when they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were stunned by what they saw. State troopers were lined up, carrying bullwhips and billy clubs, many wearing gas masks, and all in hard hats. The officers moved forward and released tear gas. A 9-year-old girl named Cheyenne Webb was among the marchers.
People were running and falling and ducking, and you could hear the whips swishing, and you'd hear them striking people. I tried to run home as fast as I could. Hosea Williams picked me up, and I told him to put me down. He wasn't running fast enough.
"48 hours later, Martin Luther King arrived in Selma. He had sent telegrams to clergymen, black and white, asking them to join him for a minister's march to Montgomery.
So we are happy to have our white brothers and sisters come from all over the United States to join with us in this movement, and they're going to march.
One of the white clergymen was a Unitarian minister from Boston named James Reeve. In Selma one night, he ate dinner in a black cafe. As he left the restaurant, he was clubbed to death by angry white citizens.
At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama.
President Johnson announced that he was sending a voting rights bill to Congress. He finished by quoting words from the great civil rights song.
And we shall overcome.
We are not afraid.
6 days after Johnson's speech, 4,000 people, black and white, marched from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma to Montgomery, camping out at night and singing songs of freedom. This time, National Guardsmen protected them. By the time they reached the Capitol, 25,000 people had joined the march. 10 years earlier, Martin Luther King was a little-known preacher. Now, he was a world-famous symbol of freedom. By 1967, Lyndon Johnson was miserable. His war against poverty was being undermined and overshadowed by the war in Vietnam. He didn't seem to be able to admit that he had made a mistake by escalating it. And he had started saying things that weren't quite true. He had said all the bombing was aimed at military targets. But television screens showed images of houses being burned and schools filled with children flattened by bombs. In response, anti-war demonstrations exploded across America. Soon, thousands of young men, many of them on college campuses, were burning their draft cards. Paul Potter was president of the Students for a Democratic Society.
The president says that we are defending freedom in Vietnam. Whose freedom? Not the freedom of the Vietnamese. And what has the war done for freedom in America?
America's youth seemed to recognize before anyone else that the war was destroying the nation. Among other things, it had derailed the federal poverty program, leading to worsening conditions, especially in urban areas. Along with a new generation of black leaders, Martin Luther King was growing more and more frustrated.
The national administration of our country is more concerned about winning the war in Vietnam than winning the war against poverty right here in the United States.
As the war escalated by the mid to late 1960s, there just wasn't enough money to go around, and the Great Society had to be scaled back. King had realized that African Americans had gained their civil and political rights, but they still were very disadvantaged economically. And he said the issue of economic inequality is the next question of freedom in this country. And in a way, King, at the very end of his life, was putting on the agenda a question of freedom which we still haven't solved in this country, the vast gap between the rich and the poor and the lack of real economic freedom for considerable numbers of Americans.
You tell me there's fun.
To support economic freedom for African Americans, Martin Luther King decided to go to Memphis to march with garbage workers who were striking for better pay.
I believe firmly that this cause is right, and that someone must have the courage and the fortitude to stand up for it, even if it means suffering or even if it means death.
On March 31st, along with millions of Americans, King turned on the TV to watch a live broadcast from Washington.
Good evening, my fellow
President Johnson was making an important announcement.
Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast
North
Asia.
Vietnam's Tet Offensive had made it clear to the president that Americans could not win the war.
No other dream.
Johnson said he was cutting back on the bombing and would try to get a settlement of the war. Then, he stunned the nation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Just 3 days later, Dr. King spoke to a huge crowd in Memphis. There was strong religious feeling in his voice and a sense that his time was running out.
The promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, on the balcony off his room at the Lorraine Motel, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead. He was 39 years old.
The urban uprisings, riots, which took place after King's assassination, really reflected the unfinished agenda of the civil rights movement. The desperate poverty of so many African Americans in the urban ghettos of the North. The civil rights movement had been a Southern movement. But now you had these uprisings in Harlem, in Watts, in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., outside of the Deep South, where the problem was economic inequality, poor education, police brutality, many other kinds of inequality. And so in a sense, it shocked much of the nation to realizing that more needed to be done.
Martin Luther King Jr. was carried to his grave in a casket of polished African mahogany on a plain farm cart pulled by 2 mules. The cart and the mules reminded people that King's ancestors farmed America's land with courage and dignity. The mahogany symbolized his African heritage. Thousands of people came out to pay tribute to a man whose name would be forever linked to freedom.
This I do believe deeply.
I have a dream today.
The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together, as never in the past, to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.